Hello everybody and welcome to another tutorial. This time I'm going to show you how to make a somewhat film print look without using lookup tables, entirely done with the tools that come with DaVinci Resolve. And it's a mixed set of footage. There's some H.265 from a Mavic Pro 2, and we've got the Blackmagic RAW, which is being debayered in the Gen 5 color science, which has a pretty steep slope to the curve on it. It reminds me of Asus CCT in a way, but the color space is, just after a couple tests I've run, the same in Gen 5 as it was in Gen 4. So it's the same primaries, though without the red clipping issue. And the S-curve, or rather the inverse S-curve that you have on the log profile for it, is very Asus CCT-like very steep, super logarithmic, if you will, which is interesting and strange. I wish that they had nailed the log C style curve that's used on most other log profiles by most other camera manufacturers, like Sony's S-Log3, Canon C-Log2, V-Log from Panasonic, the Eterna log or F-Log, excuse me, on the Fuji cameras. I wish the Blackmagic would pursue that route for universal compatibility's sake. However, instead they have jumped all in on mimicking Asus CC or CCT style curves, which, to be honest, it might end up being the smarter route to go in the long term, as, say, 5-10 years from now, we've moved away from the film basis of video color grading and more into the all digital future that faces us, which is going to probably be dominated by Asus as our main method of converting and conversions, especially as Asus begins to mature. I'm waiting to see what Asus 2.0 is going to be like, but for the time being, none of that matters. We're going to do something that every colorist will tell you don't do, and that is just boost the saturation on your footage. So, to properly saturate this footage after running some tests on my own, about 65, going from Blackmagic film into what we need to do this. Next thing we're going to do is our contrast curve, which is about 1.66, once again from tests that I have run. And I'm going to just copy this and apply this grade to all of these, which will lighten the curve. It's a bit, that S curve is a bit too much, too steep for the drone footage, but I'll get to that momentarily. For now, we're just focusing on the Blackmagic Pocket footage in Gen 5 color science. So the reason I'm picking Gen 5 is because there were some issues with red on some of these motocross bikes, where the red channel would kind of clip and splash into these harsh, almost pinkish and purplish highlights, where the Gen 5 color science solves that. So it's much easier to work with overall, despite the curve being a bit harder to tame at first glance. So for color balance, we're sticking exclusively with the printer lights on the offset. What I mean by that is I am not going to adjust my luminance and offset at all, with a few exceptions. There will be exceptions, but I'm mostly going to stick with my pivot for exposure, my offset for color, and then if I need to tweak the density of the image at the end, I'm going to use my shadow and highlight tools to push and pull the top and the bottom extremes of the image. But I have a feeling I'm going to rarely be touching the shadow and highlight. It's mostly going to be pivot and offset. There's one piece of footage that I do know I will be using for a fact the shadow controls on, just because it's a little overexposed in a way that you can't get the density to a point that I'm happy with. So I'm more or less just going to get it to a point that I like the overall look. Pull the shadows down, slightly tweak it a little bit more, pull the shadows up. There you go. Quick and easy. Very simple. And this process is actually very fast to do. It's not film emulation, obviously. it is more of a vaguely print-like response that you get from the S-curve. Because naturally, when you make a film print, everything is going to be on an S-curve. So you see this one, my exposure won't go down below the 128 on my IRE. So I'm going to pop that down just a little bit on the shadows to regain some of that contrast. The weird thing is the characteristics of doing it this way do work a little bit funky compared to what you would get if this were a film print. What I mean by that is your exposure will not go down beyond a certain point if you've overexposed. 128 seems to be about like a clamping point. If you're underexposed, it won't go over 640. If you were actually working with a film print, which I'm going to just mimic something because I haven't tried this yet, but I want to see. You would actually have the opposite effect where pulling down. No, it's doing about the same thing. Pulling down would lead to, from an overexposed, would actually lead to darker images, and pulling up from underexposed would lead to lighter images. So it's the characteristic on the low end is kind of and high end are kind of flipped compared to what it would be if you were actually printing a photograph now, or a even a film print would behave. I think that might just be because we're working with a positive in a positive environment. We're not going positive to negative. So the exposure values are never really flipped like they would be if you're printing from a negative. But just, my darkroom experience that I have from college, and then, seeing what I've seen from film prints and all is quite fascinating that there's such a difference between how the prints work versus how the positives work here in Resolve. So anyway, we've gotten to our point where we're going to start making our tint corrections in just 1 second, because this is a point where the lighting conditions on this day had changed a little bit. Also, I'm apparently going to be using shadow more often than I thought I would. That's perfectly fine. A little too crunchy there. A little too Captain Crunch. Don't want that. So I'm going to grab this as a comparison still. We're going to go over here. Rather than trying to align the values exact, because the contrast ratios, it's all natural light. Like everything is so different shot to shot with this. I'm more or less just going to try to hit like the major vibe of it and just visually kind of connect the two. Whereas, once again, most real colorists would say, hey, maybe don't do that, because, you're not working with exact values anymore when you're doing it that way. You're just eyeballing this shenanigans. And they would be right. But, this is going to be a really weirdly arrogant thing for a guy who calls himself an amateur to say, but all my time seeing stuff about film prints, the majority of times that people are printing motion pictures, and I know for a fact every time I've ever had to do a print in a darkroom, it's all eyeballed. Like there's no, you're not sitting there with a scope on the enlarger going, is this density accurate? Is this color or tone accurate to this other? It was all eyeballed and all about just like feeling. Did I like it? Did I not like it? So that's just my 2 cents on it. As mentioned, I am Billy Causey Jr., the amateur colorist, so please take that into consideration if you want to heed my advice. Quite frankly, I would say don't heed my advice. Let me mute this. I would say don't heed my advice. Instead, just use me for some cool tricks here and there. But like my big meta advice, don't heed it. So I'm going to have to turn extended video off because this is one that did clip. And we have this harsh little haloing effect going on right there, which is not appealing at all. Being outdoors, I also didn't really have access to much in the way of ND filters. So I was having to shoot at 100 ISO with this, and it led to some moments where things clipped even though they looked good to me on the monitor. And my zebras, I made the false assumption that 100 was my clip point on my zebras on the pocket, and no, it turns out it's actually 95. 95 is your hard clip point, but it's fine. I just brought those values up. It looks fine now. So we are doing good today, my friend. And once again, there's no hard or fast rule. I'm using my scopes in the bottom right corner to give me an idea of what's going on with the data, but I'm not necessarily using it to measure anything. You know, there's no right or wrong to what I'm doing. There's no like target values I'm trying to hit. I'm just using it to be like, okay, you know, the dirt right here is causing this red spike, and our blue is very low because it's mostly a warm, like kind of goldenish tint to the majority of the image, split between the green in the trees and the more brownish reddy tones in the dirt. My exposure is also pretty low, with my peaks peaking at about 196 excuse me, and my lowest low being just barely above, you know, about the 50 line. So what that means is I can push up and still maintain the appearance of contrast, despite the fact that my black level is actually really high. Or I can push down, and even though my black level is still really high, it appears to have more contrast and be darker than it actually is. This is essentially changing densities. It's more about compressing the contrast ratio and pushing data into the extremes away from the center of the exposure than it is about like pushing those extremes up or down. Anyway. All right, we get to our first of these shots here. Let's see, is it 1.5? No, that's too much. 1.4. Yes, 1.4 seems to be about accurate. So these are all grouped. So all of these Blackmagic clips are grouped. You know, just click them, right click, put into a group. My group pre-clip is where I did my saturation. I'm going to do saturation on group pre-clip for these as well. Let's go back to clip level for it. Let's do 1.3, 1.35. Okay. It's 0.435, excuse me. So we have our basis, which all of these drone clips are going to be using. And I'm not even going to try to like match them 100%. Like that's not what this tutorial or like showcase, I guess showcase more than tutorial. That's not what this is about. This isn't necessarily about matching shots together. Because if I was going to do that, I'd be using transforms. But this is instead about getting the general vibe of like using different film stocks. Like, for example, the characteristics, because I have played with some film stocks. I didn't shoot the film stocks, unfortunately. Motion picture film is something I have yet to play too much with. But I have done some color work on a couple stocks for archival groups. And the curve that you get out of, or rather not the curve, because the gamma curve in film scans can vary based upon the scanner. Color spaces can also vary, but like the general vibe that I get from these DJI shots reminds me a bit more of like the Fuji style. It's kind of like how Sony and Panasonic lean a bit toward the Fuji style as well. But then, you know, other companies like Arri and Red lean more toward the Kodak type color spaces and looks, to the point that essentially like Arri and Kodak are kind of competing with each other. Because the Vision 3 stock, especially, you know, 2319 it's got a very Alexa like look to it when it's scanned. But that's a whole conversation there about, color spaces and the processes, and the fact that, with film, it's not just like your capture that determines your starting point, but also, what your scanning device is, how it was processed, what chemicals were used to process it, what was the time limit that you spent processing, was there any reciprocity issues, is it bleach bypass, is it not, was it rim jet stripped, or was it with the rim jet? Because it's going to change the look significantly, especially if you do rim jet stripped, because you're going to get halation bouncing all around that image, which will tend to lead it to be a bit more red and have a bit more of almost like an infrared pollution look to it. Only instead of the red colors being infiltrated into the low end, it'll be in the high end. So you'll have more of a pinky white tone, and skin tones will skew a little red on the high end, and things that blow out are going to get this big, bold red glow around them. Fascinating stuff. I love it. It's just expensive to play with, and your boy ain't got the money to do that, unfortunately. I wish, God, I so wish I did have the money to do that, but c'est la vie. We don't always get what we want in life, and it sucks. So one thing I am going to do, these trees are a bit yellow compared to the rest of the image over here. So let's pop into HSL. See if we can get a little touch, not too much, just a little touch of green. Nothing has it all. Bury the place I've been. Oh, sorry. Touch of red. Touch of red. Break away. So that's too much of an effect on the image. Can't quite get them because I wanted to get them as jade colored as these in the background here, but can't quite get there. So instead of using that as my basis, I'm going to take a look at this because this is a similar lighting condition. Yeah, I know. Despite this looking super cloudy, it's actually a similar lighting condition to this shot here. They're only taken minutes apart. It's just that the DJI log is very desaturated in both the highlight and the shadows. And despite it being a very punchy log curve, it feels like it has less dynamic range than it appears to. It looks really data filled, a very healthy negative look almost. But when you start trying to work with it, you keep running out of room very quickly. So I suspect that this DJI footage actually has a bit less to it than first glances would have you assume. It's also, as I mentioned, a very punchy curve. Point that I'm not even sure exactly what ratio I'm comfortable with yet in terms of my contrast. Maybe 1.25. Yeah, that's better. That's a lot less punchy. 1.25. Let's head back over here. 1.25. So let's ditch this one. This will be our new base going forward for these. Apply grade. Now I know there's a way to do shared nodes. I just don't have the patience to go through and set up a shared node, but you can go in and do, set as a shared node. But since I'm using pivot 2, that's not necessarily going to work. And I need to play around with using offset under, because it looks like offset might do more like what I'm thinking would happen with a print where, it actually pushes the values up and down because, it's offsetting the whole thing. Meanwhile, the pivot, let me just make a curve and show you in the center here. So let's just say this is the curve that our contrast is giving us. It's not accurate to the actual contrast S curve. This is just a really rough damn thing that I'm putting together. Oh shit. No, what? Why you do that? Okay, let's turn editable splines back on then. What the fuck? Let's just say this is our thing. This is a goofy ass, because of the splines. It's a okay. That's a bit. Wish I had a better way of showing what this is doing, but I don't want to go dig around and try to find like a gray card to show it with. Anyway, essentially what you're doing with your pivot is taking the gamma part of your S curve and moving it up and down. Let's do default anchors, see if that works better. Okay, so yeah. So it'll be like right here in the center. It's kind of doing something like that. But even then, like when it pulls, it will eventually pull up on the bottom because it's like linked to that. And when it pulls, it will also eventually pull from the top. Because it's linked to that as well. So it's hard to do with just simple curve tools because there's so many parts of like, you know, the pivot contrast tools that are linked. But when using offset, it feels like instead of moving just that gamma point and then dragging the extreme of the others around with it, instead what it feels like it's doing is it's just picking up that whole S curve and moving it up and down, you know, like that whole exposure is going up and down, which, I mean, it's offset. It's kind of what offset does, but, you know. See, like, just as an example, let's do 1.2 real quick. And we're going to do offset down until, yeah, about right there. Grab a still for comparison's sake. This is like me doing a really rough test without using a Macbeth chart. I prefer to use a Macbeth chart, but okay, yeah, see? With my pivot, I lose density. But with my offset, I maintained that density. So what that means is that this might even be simpler to do than I'm making it sound. It might even be something where you can just go on to your timeline level. Or in this case, you know, because there's multiple pieces of footage, you know, just go to your group post clip level. Why do I have that turned on? Go to your group post clip level. Just set like 1.25 as my contrast ratio for these. And then just go clip to clip with offset. So you're just like, you know, get your exposure and then get your color, and you're good to go. I'm going to play around with that just in case, because sometimes whenever you do combinations like that, footage can break, colors can go out of gamut, some wonky things can happen. So, new discovery, which I feel kind of like an idiot for not making that discovery before now. Simply because the basis behind that is not too different from just, you know, using like a film print LUT or using ACEs, getting things into an S curve that way and then working under it with offset. So it feels like the kind of thing that should have been obvious to me, but unfortunately it wasn't until I just realized like, oh yeah, I'm doing this a little too by the books. Contrast offset pivot is a very old way of normalizing footage. It actually goes back to NLE and color systems that were predating the idea of doing an S curve digitally. So let's turn this off. Some older systems would work using, you know, contrast offset and pivot, but there's no S curve to it, so you would still, like, you know, clip your highlights and you know, blow things out, but you would set that and then still have like control over all of this. So like, let's just roll back through some of these and see, you know, examples like, okay, you know, clipping highlights, etc., 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 clipping lowlights, etc., etc., etc. And then you would have to use like a broadcast safe filter at the end to avoid having any details outside of that. Otherwise, you get sued by the FCC. They'd be like, "Oh shit, you colors illegal. Get the fuck out, illegal colors. Go away." And you're like, "Man, you guys needed like a better terminology for that, because that sounds a little iffy." Anyway. A little too much red in this. Let's pop that there. Man, motocross stuff is fun. Blackmagic cameras are fun. So, at my day job, we use a Sony FS7-2 Mark II. I have tried so hard to like that camera. I just cannot. Like, I've used Sony cameras before. I've even used the FS7 before and never had much of a problem with it until I started to have to use one on a regular basis. And now it just, that footage, it can be wrangled. S-Log can be wrangled. But is it worth it? Because the effort that you put into just getting basic, like, decent looking footage can sometimes be a pain in the butt. And it has nothing to do with the curve of S-Log. Like, the log curve in S-Log is freaking amazing. It's the color space, both .cine and the regular that have issues. Because if you shoot S-Gamut 3 regular, very frequently during the color transform, colors will go out of gamut. And it's very hard to get them back. You can't just HSL that stuff. You actually have to go through the process of like limiting your color gamut before the transform. Okay, cool. Well, then just shoot S-Gamut 3 Cine because it's a smaller gamut. That's fine, except there's some weird saturation issues where once you get like red objects in the scene that are like a certain luminance value or saturation value, they turn purple and magenta, including people's skin tones. People who have a little bit more like ruddy skin tone, suddenly they're walking around looking like the girl who just ate the grape off of Willy Wonka. And it just, I don't know of a good solution, especially since we have a lot of clients who have red as their primary color in their uniforms, their logos, etc. And we can never get that red color right. And we have been told, hey guys, this is wrong so many times. I just, So anyway. Fun stuff. And now for the pièce de résistance for this. So to sell the film look, now that we've gotten everything done here, I'm going to go through a couple cheap tricks that are pretty effective in my opinion. So we're going to do analog damage with a telecine wobble of 0.5. We're going to go and fix the overscan issues by doing an overscan of 0.999. Going to go over here and we're going to do before that we need to do our film grain first. So film grain here, going to do 35 millimeter. We're going to do linear light. Yeah, linear light's the correct one. I couldn't remember for a second. I'm also trying to remember like what order. Yes, it's after. So it's after analog. No, it is before the analog damage. My bad. Because I'm gonna bring it back with sharpness. It's been a while since I've done this trick. Ever since Film Convert started using Cineon as an output format, I haven't had to work this way in a bit. I've been using my dang ASUS Causi color, quote as I call it, method. So we're gonna go over here with the sharpness now. We're just gonna do one little pop of sharpness. Pop. See, it brings that grain back. Then we're going to go on this one, and we're going to set the gamma to linear. Pop, pop. up 2 on that red channel. Excuse me, up 3 on that red channel. That's what it is. Up 3 on that red channel, and there we go. Should sell the film print look for most people in most situations. Is it accurate? Hell no. Is it the best I could do? Hell no. But it's quick, convenient, and if you already own Resolve and have the studio version where you have access to like the analog damage tool and everything, it's very quick and cheap to do too. You're not having to buy external plugins. You're not having to spend a lot of time and money, tweaking things. I am going to play around more with just using offset underneath the contrast, because that's probably going to be an even better solution. Though because whenever I first got into color grading, like contrast offset pivot was the way I did everything. I didn't have access to all the lookup tables. I didn't really have access to much in the way of full versions of software. I was using the free version of DaVinci in like DaVinci 12 and doing contrast offset pivot for everything. I first started shooting a log on a Sony A7S II. I started getting footage in from an FS700 that a friend owned. And I learned how to do log grading on both of those cameras' footages coming in. That was S-Log2 on that FS7 or FS700 on the FS700. And I at the time was doing S-Log2 on the A7S II. It wasn't until I started to learn about printing and Cineon and why certain curves work a certain way and reading some white papers. It's like, S-Log3 is actually designed to work with this is what blows my mind about like why I have so many issues with S-Log3, because according to the white papers, S-Log3 SCAMET3 Cine is designed to work with print LUTs like the ones built into Resolve. You're supposed to just be able to up the saturation by like 103%. So just go up from 50 to 100. Make sure I think my math is wrong on that. I think it's anyway. 103% from your starting saturation is what you need to up your saturation to, and then you're good to go. Like you just offset after that. If you want to get primaries to match up, with like what the printing density would be expecting, they have like a way that you can use a Macbeth chart and set your primaries up that way. They have specific targets that you can hit with those, red, green, blue, cyan, yellow, magenta secondaries as well. So there are white papers officially from Sony that are like, hey, if you're going to print out, do a film out, here's what you need to do that. And it seems so simple and so easy. Yet why is it I fight with S-Log3, SCAMET3 Cine so much all the time? It may even just be that it's the FS7, and if I were working with like an F5 or an F55 or something, it would be better. But so many people love the FS7 too, so I don't know. Maybe we got unlucky and we just have a faulty unit. I've contacted Sony. From what they said, everything is within normal ranges, but we still have issues. So I don't know what the deal is. Anyway. This has been a brief overlook of a quick film-like grading process. Also, I think maybe three punches on that red blur might be too much. We're going to bring it back down to 2. Yeah, 2's fine. A quick look at a film-like way to do normalization of log curves and to do color grading. Also, once again, I didn't balance this shit well because that's whatever. Why am I suddenly caring? I went through this whole video not caring about like my temp or my contrast ratios matching, or even making sure that the trees were the same shade of green. Anyway. It's a thing. It's quick. Obviously, it works better if single cam, unless you want to make it have that whole old school like mixed footage from different cameras is obviously mixed footage from different cameras kind of vibe. But it works. Just play with it, man. Like that's kind of the thing that I have learned as an amateur colorist. Just vibe with this stuff, play with it, learn what you like in terms of workflow and what your clients are expecting in terms of output, and just have fun. Like this stuff is cool. Being able to like play with the world, like paint. Okay, if cinematography is painting with light, color grading is painting with paint. It's a weird way of saying it, but it is. It's like you're taking the image that exists and then tweaking it. It's almost like inking. You think about like comic books. You got the guy who comes in and does the line work, and then you come back as the inker to like polish up that line work. It's kind of like that. There's a little too much green in these. Looks a little too orangey. Anyway, once again, I'm now nitpicking my own work and something that's meant to just be like a quick demonstration. But yeah, I have used this a lot. I will probably continue to use it in the future for situations where I don't have time or need to go through more elaborate color space conversions, and especially for something that's quick and dirty. If you don't have color charts in any of your shots, if you're working with footage from like a camera that you're not even sure, what log format it's in or color space it's in, this is just a quick, dirty, easy way to get stuff done, and it's effective, and it still has that print look to it. For someone who's a casual observer, they wouldn't be able to know that this wasn't a print LUT. You could probably even take a lot of colorists who haven't played much with doing film outs, and they wouldn't be able to tell you like this isn't a film LUT. They would just think like, oh yeah, you knew exactly what you're doing. You had the right film LUT, the right conversions. This is fine. Just yeah, it's fun. Enjoy it. Peace out.